I have a lot of vivid and lucid dreams, and I have the apparently odd ability to remember dreams without writing them down or using other external aids. They just stick with me. I've dreamed of buildings and places I've never been to, and then visited them later on in real life, which I guess you could describe as a glitch in the Matrix, but this is the only occurrence I've ever had of interacting with a person I didn't know in a dream, and then meeting them in real life. My very first relationship began in high school with a boy named John that I had known for years. He was sweet enough, but somewhere around junior year, when our relationship matured, he became very aggressive, and the early signs of serious abuse started rearing their heads. Near the end of our relationship in senior year of school, I had a strange dream. Everything was in a yellow haze. I somehow knew it was evening in my dream, and I was in a home I had never been to. I rounded the corner of a separating wall from the living room to the kitchen of the house, and a man was standing there. I felt warm and joyful, and a love towards him that was so strong I didn't hesitate to run up and hug him. In the dream, I placed my hands on his shoulders and said, "John, why are you so tall?" The dream figure was a solid head taller than me, while John in reality was only about an inch taller than me. That's when I noticed his long, curly, dark hair and realized something was wrong. I asked him why his hair was so long, since John's was only a simple short cut. Just as my dream self was realizing that it wasn't John, the figure laughed warmly, and I woke up feeling calm. Writing that down now, it sounds like a scary dream, but I remember feeling such a strange relief that I hadn't experienced at all during my years with John. Not more than a month later, I was at church and noticed a new family that had just begun attending. They had 2 daughters and 2 sons, the eldest of which was a tall guy around my age, with curly, dark hair that came down to his shoulders. I felt an immediate attachment to him, despite not yet realizing that he was the person from my dream. A few months passed, during which John and I broke up, and the new boy from church and I started dating. The first time I visited his family in their home, I had to hold back the shock I was feeling. As soon as I saw their kitchen, I knew it was the same one from my dream, and I realized it was this guy who I had hugged in that yellow haze. Years later, when we were engaged to be married, I told him about the dream, and he shared a strange detail with me as well. One of the first guitars he was ever given, he named Laura, my name. As an added bonus, I had found a Mayfield dairy keychain in high school right before I met my now husband. I thought it was kind of funny, so I kept it on my purse. It was his father's new job with Mayfield Dairy that brought his family to the new town where we met in the first place. Like many children, I used to get up on Sunday mornings to watch cartoons. Recently, I had a flash of nostalgia and wanted to look up the intros to all my favorite shows from the early 90s, so I started searching around for them on YouTube. I found the Fruities, the Biscuits, and a pup named Scooby-Doo, just to name a few, but there's one that I still can't find any trace of. It was called The Cockadoos, and it was an American or Canadian cartoon about a cockerel who lived in a hen shed on a farm with his family, and would spend every episode trying to become famous. I asked my mom if she remembered it, and she said yes, but also that it was a bit naughty for a children's show, since they used to say things like, "clucking heck" and "cluck you." My sister even recalled one scene where the mother, who always wore a yellow, frilly apron, put a frying pan on the floor and sat on it. They showed her cartoon face straining, and then there was a crack sound. She put the pan, which now had a cracked egg in it, on the stove and then called her kids in for breakfast. I figured it must have been taken off air, as my sister said it only came on about 3 or 4 mornings, and then we couldn't find it anymore when we scrolled through the channels. We could still remember the catchy theme song though, and started singing it together. Then we remembered something really strange. On one particular episode, the main character, whose name I can't remember, was trying out a bunch of wacky things to become a celebrity on the net. This seemed kind of weird, since children in the early 90s wouldn't have been able to relate to jokes about the internet. The craziest part about this was that in one scene, I remember in detail that the main character recorded himself and the other animals catapulting themselves into the air with crash helmets. The cow, who I think was named Bella or Bulla, then uploaded it onto the computer to a site she called MooTube, which was continually referenced throughout the episode. I was saying to my sister that at the time, we must have been too young to realize that this was a play on the word YouTube, but as I said that, my sister interrupted me to remind me that YouTube didn't exist back then. She said she remembered it too, but it would have been impossible to reference YouTube at that time. I even recall that every time they checked to see how many hits they had, a big picture would appear on the computer screen of a red rectangle with a white hoofprint inside, clearly a reference to the YouTube logo. I looked it up, and sure enough, YouTube wasn't created until 2005, a full 10 years after we remember this TV show. I speculated that we might have been older when we saw it, and we were just mixing it up with a similar show, but my sister was around 10 or 11 at the time, and she was 100% sure it was at our first house, which we left when I was 7. To be honest, I only remember watching it at that house too, so it had to have been somewhere between 1994 and 1996. Confused as hell, we began trying to hunt down the show. We searched everywhere, and even tried emailing the BBC, ITV, and Channel 4 because we couldn't recall which network it was from, and we only had the 5 basic cable channels back then. We haven't heard back from any of them yet, but that was only about a week ago, so we'll wait and see. My sister figured they just won't know what we're talking about, but I figure it surely must be in their archives. Can a show just disappear without any record? There's literally no trace of this show on the internet. No one knows what we're talking about. No one we know outside of our household even vaguely remembers it. My sister said to me last night that given the MooTube reference, maybe it hadn't been invented yet, and we were watching a show from the future. I laughed at first. We both did, but now I'm wondering. I don't even remember it being announced by presenters or featured in the Up Next lineup. We just used to flick through the channels until we found it. What if there was a signal from the future to our old boxy Panasonic? Honestly, I'm a little freaked out and I get the chills now whenever I think about it. If you know the show I'm talking about, it's called The Cockadoos. The animation was a lot like Two Stupid Dogs, but more ropey and exaggerated. The family was a chicken, his mom, dad, sister, and grandmother, and they had a few friends on the farm. A pig, a cow, and possibly some others I can't remember. Please let me know if you remember this at all so I can investigate further and put it to bed. I've always loved the outdoors. I was fortunate enough to be born in the Great Pacific Northwest, the Western Washington Cascades to be exact. My father and I spent much of my early years of life exploring the mountains, fishing, and hunting. There are parts of the Cascades I know like the back of my hand. One of those places is called Goblin Creek, up the Index Galima Road off Highway 2. When I was a kid, we used to drive up there to do some fishing and shooting, but also like to collect a specific type of rock. When you would cut them in half and polish them, it would resemble a scenic picture of the view of the mountains from within a cave. I don't recall the true name of these stones, we just called them picture rocks. My father's friend owned an art gallery and a mineral shop that used to be a church. If you've ever driven through Startup on your way from Sultan to Gold Bar on Highway 2, you might remember seeing the robot sculpture outside the shop that my dad built. This is the place where we sold the stones for about $2 a pound. It was lucrative revenue for a preteen. The walk from the creek to where we harvested these rocks on the dirt road wasn't particularly long, but lengthy enough that you could presumably get lost while en route if you didn't know where to go. In the years we spent at this creek, I had only ever seen 2 other people out there. One was a game warden that had heard the gunshots from our target practicing session and tracked us down to make sure everything was fine. The other is the subject of my curiosity. When I was about 14, I distinctly remember hauling a backpack full of these rocks up from the creek to my dad's truck. Along the way, I ran into a man that looked to be about 30 years old. He was heading down to the creek, and I was heading up the road. We both appeared to be surprised that we would run into anyone in this rather remote section of the mountains, but as I got closer to this man, he seemed to grow increasingly more startled, as if he was seeing a ghost. He didn't say anything as I passed. He just stared at me, seemingly trying to figure out the appropriate words to say. After passing him, I remember thinking how much that guy looked like he could be in my family. The similarities were striking. I continued onto the truck, dumped my load of rocks off, and headed back down to the river to my dad. When I arrived, I told him about the encounter and asked him if he had seen this man, to which he replied that he hadn't. I've remembered this encounter quite vividly since then. Last year, I was visiting my family in Snohomish and decided to head up to Old Goblin Creek for nostalgic purposes. It's been about 15 years since I was last up there. Along the way up, I found that the Index Galima Road had apparently washed out years before, but luckily I knew of another way, up Jack Pass. I found the dirt road and parked where my dad used to park, and proceeded to walk through the woods down to the creek. Along the way, I saw something that absolutely shook me to the core. When I was about halfway through the woods, I was startled to see someone else coming up the creek. A boy, about 14 years old. He was wearing a backpack that looked to be burdened with heavy weights. As we got closer, I began to get increasingly confused and shocked, as the boy looked exactly like I did at his age. I meant to say something to him as he passed, but I couldn't figure out the right words to express what I was thinking at the moment. He passed me and kept going. I walked a little ways and finally stopped when it all really hit me. I remembered the encounter from my teenage years and realized I must have just lived the other half of the experience. Both the man and the boy were me, roughly 15 years apart. I turned around to catch up to the boy in the thick western Washington woods. I ran all the way back up to the road to where my truck was to find nothing. There wasn't anywhere else besides that road for him to go, and I hadn't stalled long enough to not be able to catch up to him. He was simply gone. Curiosity got the best of me, so I hurried down to the creek, half expecting to find my dad fishing on the bank 15 years younger, but found nobody. I ended up going home and deciding that this experience was too unbelievable to tell my friends and family. I just wanted to get this out there online to see what others think, and hopefully to see if anyone else has had this type of experience as well.